All right, welcome to the deep dive. We're all about taking those sources you give us and, really getting down into the nitty-gritty, extracting the most fascinating, unexpected, crucial insights.
Think of it as your express ticket to really being in the know, carefully crafted, just for you, the learner.
Exactly. And today we're taking a deep dive into a text I bet you're already familiar with, at least in its movie form, The Princess Bride.
But we're not just revisiting the story itself, are we? We're going behind the scenes with William Goldman's own account of how this beloved classic came to be.
Absolutely. I mean, who doesn't love the movie, right? But
Yep.
this dive is all about going deeper, straight to Goldman's perspective on the novel itself. The writing process, the casting challenges, some of which are hilarious, and all those personal reflections he weaves right into the narrative.
So, our mission today is pretty clear. To understand Goldman's unique journey with The Princess Bride and uncover some of those surprising details about its creation, the stuff you wouldn't know just from watching the film. It really offers a look into the creative process and that bond an author can have with their work.
A bond that can be pretty powerful at times, it seems. And one of the first things that really grabs you in Goldman's account is his description of Andre the Giant. He paints this vivid picture of Andre on a freezing night in Sheffield, seemingly impervious to the cold, just wearing his wrestling tights and a small towel.
What's striking is that contrast, right? I mean, everyone around him is bundled up, offering him coats and blankets, and Andre just politely, consistently refuses, "No, boss. Thank you, boss. I'm fine." It's almost like superhuman.
Yeah, exactly. And it ties right into the casting. Goldman actually mentions he'd envisioned Andre as Fezzik way back when his father first read him the Morgenstern book, though he admits, with a bit of a wink, that seeing Andre on TV in 41 wouldn't have been possible since he encountered the book first.
It's fascinating how our imaginations work, isn't it? Even if the timeline doesn't quite match up, that image of Andre clearly resonated so strongly with Goldman's internal vision of Fezzik that he retroactively placed it in his memory.
Absolutely. And then there are those other details about Andre that are just pure gold, like his thick French accent during script readings and oh, that story about the challenge of finding a chair that could actually fit him at a London bistro.
And his solution, he just widens the metal arms himself like it's nothing.
Exactly. You get this sense of almost a mythical figure navigating a world that's just not built for him.
It's a great example of those little practical realities of bringing a fantastical story to life. You have these larger-than-life characters, and then you have to figure out how they interact with something as simple as, well, furniture.
Absolutely. And speaking of iconic elements, let's talk about the six-fingered sword. Goldman talks about visiting with Willie, the actual sword used in the film, but it wasn't just a prop for him, was it?
No, not at all. I mean, he'd been fascinated by that sword since he was a kid, after his father read him Buttercup's Baby, the Morgenstern original. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It carried the weight of, well, Inigo's entire life, his quest for revenge.
His father died for it, and Inigo dedicated his life to avenging that death. And Goldman describes seeing it in the display case, how it seemed to be dancing in the light. It really speaks to the magic it held for him.
That's the power of objects in storytelling, isn't it? That sword isn't just a weapon. It's a symbol of loss, dedication, and the pursuit of justice.
Absolutely. Now, Goldman also gets very honest, almost painfully so, about his own relationship with writing. He mentions this encounter with someone who claimed to be a former fan, saying Goldman used to be a wonderful writer once.
That must have stung. You can really feel his vulnerability in sharing that, likely because he was struggling with those anxieties himself.
Yeah.
He even says that immersing himself in Buttercup's Baby was his way of trying to, well, become a novelist again.
Yeah. And then there's this great moment where Willie, his grandson, jumps in and says, he's still wonderful.
It's so touching. And it shows how personal creative work can be, right?
Mm.
I mean, Goldman goes on to say, "The Princess Bride had made me want to be a novelist."
Yeah.
You can really feel that connection to the story.
Now, let's talk a little about the historical context Goldman brings up. He really insists that even in this fantastical world of Florin, there's a basis in history for characters like Vizzini, Fezzik, and Inigo, referencing things like wrestling records and fencing history.
It's fascinating because he's trying to ground this fantastical narrative in, well, some kind of reality. Florin might be made up, but those skills, those character archetypes, they have real-world parallels.
And he's adamant about sticking to certain key historical outcomes within the story, like Inigo killing Count Rugen. He even talks about wrestling with the idea of changing those outcomes.
You can see his deep connection to these characters.
Mhm.
To change something like that would feel like a betrayal, I think. Like
Yeah.
he's messing with the very history of Florin.
And he even compares it to Shakespeare and how he treated historical figures in his plays, saying that while Shakespeare might have taken liberties, he didn't fundamentally change things like Hamlet's fate.
It shows that respect for the story's internal consistency, doesn't it?
It does. Speaking of the story's journey, let's talk about the whole publishing and screenwriting process. The arrangement with Fox, where they bought the book but not the screenplay initially, that's pretty unusual.
It is unusual, yeah. Separating the rights like that must have created some interesting tension, like Goldman had to prove that his screenplay was worth their investment.
He mentions his agent, Everett Ziegler, who also handled the Butch Cassidy deal. Sounds like Ziegler knew how to navigate Hollywood. And then Goldman talks about writing the screenplay right after the abridgment, driven by this nervous energy.
That creative burst you get sometimes, that feeling of, I have to get this down now. It speaks to his passion for this story, I think.
And then he tells this great story about hearing the screenplay read aloud for the first time while he's sick in bed by his doctors and his wife. Talk about a captive audience.
It's so funny and really humanizes the whole Hollywood image, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Here's this successful writer in his pajamas, listening to his work read by, well, not exactly actors.
And then he brings in those perspectives from Elia Kazan and George Roy Hill, who emphasize the importance of the script and casting, comparing shooting a film to just a factory putting together a car.
Putting it all in perspective, right? It all comes down to those foundational elements.
Yeah.
The story, the characters, the actors who bring them to life.
Exactly. Now let's get back to casting. Specifically Fezzik. Goldman calls Andre the Giant their biggest gamble, but he was completely convinced that Andre was the only one who could play the part.
That conviction, that vision, it's remarkable. I mean, Andre was notoriously hard to get a hold of, constantly on the road with his wrestling schedule, but Goldman never wavered.
And the stories of the casting calls are almost comical. These massive men who weren't quite giants were skinny giants who didn't have the right presence.
It shows how specific that vision of Fezzik was in Goldman's mind, doesn't it? It wasn't just about size. It was about capturing, well, the essence of the character.
And then Rob Reiner finally manages to meet with Andre, and because of Andre's thick accent, he records all of Andre's lines for him to study.
Talk about commitment. They really believed in this casting choice and were willing to put in the extra work.
Absolutely. Now, stepping back a bit, Goldman reflects on his career and says that out of all the films he was involved with, he only truly loved two: Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and of course, The Princess Bride.
That's a powerful statement, isn't it? It speaks to a connection that goes beyond just professional success.
He also tells this heartwarming story about a man who reconnected with his lost love after sending her a copy of The Princess Bride years later. For Goldman, who often describes himself as living in his pit, these real-world connections fostered by the story must have meant a lot.
These little anecdotes really show the impact stories can have, right? Rekindling relationships, creating connections. It's beautiful.
Now, shifting gears a bit, Goldman talks very fondly about Miss Roginski, his third, fourth, and fifth grade teacher. He actually credits her with shaping his worldview.
The influence of a great teacher, right?
Yeah.
It's amazing how they can impact us, sometimes for our whole lives.
He even dedicated the Temple of Gold to her, though he used the name Miss Podolsky. And he tells this great story about struggling with what to write in the dedication.
All those different versions,
Yeah.
from boastful to humble, before he finally settles on this heartfelt message. It's really sweet.
And there's this great detail. Miss Roginski predicted he'd be a late bloomer. Goldman says he desperately wanted to be one as a kid, even though he didn't know what it meant.
It speaks to this sense of potential unfolding over time, a belief in the journey.
Now, speaking of journeys, Goldman is very open about his lifelong love for adventure, going all the way back to his childhood fascination with those classic swashbuckling heroes: Alan Ladd, Errol Flynn, John Wayne.
That passion is clearly at the heart of The Princess Bride, isn't it? You can see it in every sword fight, every daring escape.
He even tells this crazy story about sneaking onto an army post, still in uniform, the day after his discharge, just to see Gunga Din, the movie that inspired the title of his first novel.
He was dedicated, that's for sure. Okay, let's talk about the abridgment of The Princess Bride. Goldman famously described it as the good parts version, but it sounds like it was much more complicated than that.
Oh, yeah. His wife, Helen, even said he went a little crackers during the process.
You get this sense that condensing this beloved text was, well, an emotionally intense experience for him. He even admits that he writes on impulse and struggles with looking at his work objectively.
He ultimately hoped that this abridged version would bring others that feeling of true love and high adventure, even though he felt the latter was, sadly, missing from the real world.
bit wistful, isn't it? That yearning for those simple, heroic tales in a world that's often messy and complicated.
Okay, let's jump into the actual excerpts from Morgenstern's Buttercup's Baby. The opening, with Adela, this seemingly perfect woman suddenly consumed with fear about aging, it immediately sets a different tone from The Princess Bride.
Totally. It's all about appearances, this fear of losing beauty. It's a stark contrast to Buttercup's more genuine, down-to-earth nature.
And then we meet Buttercup at 15, completely unconcerned with being the most beautiful woman around. She's much more interested in riding her horse and, of course, teasing Wesley.
That's the Buttercup we know and love.
Yeah.
We also get those glimpses of her family, her mother's social ambitions, her father and his cows. It fleshes out her world.
Then we have the arrival of the Countess, who's immediately drawn to Wesley. Buttercup's not too thrilled about that. And the Countess's disregard for proper attire. It's pretty funny.
It shows she's not bound by those conventions. She does what she wants. And it really makes Buttercup realize her own feelings for Wesley.
And of course we have the iconic line, "As you wish."
It's so simple, but so loaded with meaning. It's the foundation of their relationship, that unspoken promise of devotion.
Then comes their farewell, with Buttercup vowing to never love another, and that moment when she breaks down and asks, "Without one kiss."
Classic. It's so raw, so real. It speaks volumes about how deeply they're already connected.
Okay, then we meet the rather unenthusiastic Prince Humperdinck. He doesn't seem too interested in finding a bride, just wants to get it done.
And let's not forget his custom-built fifth level in the Zoo of Death, reserved for a worthy opponent. That tells you everything you need to know about his priorities.
Yeah, power, conquest, a constant need for a challenge, not exactly romantic qualities. And then there's Queen Bella, beloved by the kingdom, but Humperdinck's childhood nickname for her was ES, for evil stepmother.
It shows his cynicism, his warped view of relationships, even with someone as seemingly kind as Queen Bella, and poor King Lothran just mumbling in the background.
Now, that disastrous banquet scene, Goldman describes it in detail, from the essence of brandied pig to the carefully timed wine service. And then, of course, the crosswind hits, and Princess Narina's hat goes flying.
And Humperdinck completely loses it, right?
Yeah.
5 words that nearly start a war, all because he sees Norina's bald head under her hat. Talk about vanity.
It's what kicks off the kidnapping plot. Humperdinck, in a fit of pique, dismisses Princess Narina and all of Gilder, and orders his men to find someone else to marry.
And then we have that scene with the Sicilian, the Spaniard, and the Turk planning Buttercup's kidnapping. Their plan to frame Gilder for her death. It's so cynical.
And you can't forget the Sicilian's condescending attitude toward Fezzik.
It shows the power dynamic,
Oh, yeah.
and maybe hints at some future conflict. Okay, now for the shark attack. Or rather, the lack of one.
Goldman even breaks the fourth wall, reassuring any youngsters reading that Buttercup won't be eaten by sharks. Not yet, anyway.
It's so playful. He injects his own personality into the story, and it's great. And then there's Buttercup thinking, I'm a dead cookie.
The Sicilian is so sure he can scare her into screaming, but Buttercup's defiant, and then the moon comes out. It's almost cinematic.
And Fezzik steps in when the Sicilian hits her. You see his protectiveness, even though he's often portrayed as simple.
Then we have the Cliffs of Insanity. The Sicilian, who relies on his mind, is completely freaked out by the man in black's ship appearing.
It's a great contrast. He's all about intellect, but then he's faced with something he can't outsmart.
And then Fezzik pulls their boat up the cliffs. I mean, the sheer strength. It's incredible.
Fezzik, always coming through with the brute force when they need it.
All right, let's get into Inigo's backstory. We meet Domingo Yeste, the master swordmaker. Those interactions with young Inigo, so theatrical.
Yes, he's a great character. Larger than life. And the 4-year wait, the price for one of his swords, it really shows you the value of his work.
And the moment when Inigo finally presents him with the six-fingered sword, after years of searching, it's a turning point.
But even after a decade of training, he's still not sure he's ready for revenge. And then his descent into alcoholism, after searching for the six-fingered man for years. It's heartbreaking.
It really is. And then the Sicilian finds him, vulnerable, desperate, and uses him. Okay, that scene on the mountain path, with the Sicilian constantly misreading the situation, dismissing Fezzik's rhymes.
Fezzik's so sweet, even though he's a giant. We learn about his childhood, the bullying, his dad trying to teach him to fight.
And he just hates fighting. He even talks about the crowds booing him when he wrestled.
He worked in a circus for a while, you know?
Oh, right, and got fired for being too strong.
It's funny, but also sad. He's just not made for violence.
So, the fight with the man in black, you wouldn't expect Fezzik to be so quick, but he is.
He's got that brute strength, but the man in black is just too skilled, too strategic.
The man in black wins with the chokehold. Okay, now for the Battle of Wits, the Sicilian versus the man in black, the classic poisoned wine scene.
And the Sicilian is so smug, so confident in his intellect.
But of course, he picks the wrong cup. It's such a perfect ending for his character.
Pride before the fall. It's classic.
Now, Buttercup escapes with the man in black, but then she shoves him down the ravine.
Impulse control, not her strong suit at that moment.
Then Prince Humperdinck shows up at the Cliff's Insanity and immediately starts investigating. He figures out there was a fencing match, even notices they switched hands during the fight.
You have to admit, the man's a skilled tracker. He's following the man in black's blood trail.
And then he sees the woman's footprints and realizes the princess is alive. Talk about a twist.
He's not happy.
Meanwhile, Buttercup and Westley reunite at the bottom of the ravine.
All that playful banter, that easy familiarity, it's clear how deep their connection is.
Now we get to the fire swamp. Buttercup's childhood nightmares come to life.
The popping sound of the flames, the smell of the gases, and then the RUS attack.
Wesley's cool under pressure, though. He knows the swamp, and he protects Buttercup. Then they're in the snow sand, terrifying, but also kind of beautiful.
It's so heavy, so dangerous. Buttercup nearly drowns, but Westley saves her. Again.
And then the big reveal. You see, I am the Dread Pirate Roberts.
I bet you could hear jaws dropping all across the world when people first read that.
Buttercup's in total shock. The timeline doesn't make sense, but then Wesley explains how he inherited the identity.
It's a great twist. We learn how he was captured by the original Roberts, begged for his life so he could get back to Buttercup. And Roberts, the fearsome pirate, is actually worried about seeming soft.
Wesley offers to be his valet, his slave, anything to survive, and eventually Roberts passes on the name, the ship.
It's such a clever way to explain Wesley's skills, his reputation.
Now, while all this is happening, Inigo wakes up tied to a tree, but he sees the six-fingered sword and his purpose is renewed.
And poor Fezzik, he's totally lost. Doesn't know what to do when the plan goes wrong. Those rhymes, though.
Not his best work. Back in Florence City, Buttercup's wedding procession is interrupted by that old woman. The insults just fly.
It's a harsh reminder of the societal pressure Buttercup's under. She's judged and condemned, even though she doesn't have a choice.
Okay, Goldman then talks about his reaction to the original Morgenstern ending, where Buttercup marries Humperdinck. He was not happy.
He tries to rationalize it, comes up with all these scenarios, but it's clear he's deeply bothered by the idea.
And even after he finds out it was Buttercup's dream, he's still unsettled. It's not until he talks to Edith Neisser, this wise writer friend, that he gets some peace.
She says something really profound. Life isn't fair, Bill. It's a truth we often forget, especially in stories.
Meanwhile, Wesley's in the pit of despair, being tortured. But he endures it by taking his brain away, focusing on Buttercup.
The power of love, right. Or maybe just incredible willpower. The Count and Humperdinck debate whether Wesley's actually suffering or not.
Humperdinck is getting frustrated with Buttercup still thinking about Wesley, so he tasks Yellen with rooting out Gilder spies in the thieves' quarter.
And we get that creepy scream from the zoo, which turns out to be a dog in the machine. Humperdinck's too busy with wedding plans to care.
Buttercup prays for Wesley's return. But then the Count reveals he knows about Wesley's mental trick, and he shows off the machine that sucks the life out of people.
Chillin' stuff.
Yellen goes all out cleaning up the thieves' quarter. He relies on Falkbridge, who's basically running the place through bribes.
So much corruption just under the surface. Yellen thinks he's succeeded, but of course, things are never that simple.
Inigo wakes up in the thieves' quarter and comes up with a plan. Get the man in black's help to rescue Wesley and get revenge.
They need each other, right. And they both want Humperdinck to pay.
Then we get another one of Goldman's interjections. His father skips over part of the story. It's so meta.
He's playing with the format, reminding us that he's controlling the narrative. Okay, so Inigo and Fezzik find Miracle Max and Valerie. They need a miracle to revive Wesley before the wedding.
Max is reluctant at first. He was fired by the king, but the idea of ruining Humperdinck's wedding that motivates him.
Humiliations galore. That's the goal.
Max says Wesley's mostly dead, and they only have 17 hours. He might be able to get his tongue and brain working, maybe some slow walking.
And Goldman skips over the part where they gather ingredients for the resurrection pill. He compares it to Dorothy's quest in The Wizard of Oz and says Morgenstern did the same thing.
Yellen finds out about Humperdinck's plan to kill Buttercup after the wedding and resigns. He can't do it, and he's worried his failures are because he's not up to the job.
A man of principle. He knows what's right, even if it costs him his position.
The wedding ceremony's about to begin, and then the screaming starts outside the castle.
And Buttercup thinks, here comes my Westley now.
And it is Westley, barely able to walk, with Inigo pushing him in a wheelbarrow.
And Fezzik standing in the wheelbarrow, yelling, I am the dread pirate Roberts, and there will be no survivors.
The brute squad is terrified.
I mean, who wouldn't be?
Yellen stashes the castle key. Inigo tells Fezzik to break down a door so they can get to Westley.
And Humperdinck is trying to rush the wedding, but it's too late.
Inigo confronts Count Rugen.
And Rugen recognizes him. You're that little Spanish brat.
And Inigo says it. Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die.
Chills. It's a moment we've all been waiting for.
They fight, their injuries mirroring that fateful duel years ago. Meanwhile, Westley and Humperdinck have their own duel.
A duel of wits this time, with Westley playing up his weakness.
They jump out the window, Fezzik catches them, but then they run into Yellen and the Brute Squad.
What a mess.
But Buttercup takes charge. She orders the Brutes to save Humperdinck, and they listen.
She's got that princessly authority.
They escape on the white horses, but then Inigo's wound opens up, Westley collapses, Fezzik takes a wrong turn, and Buttercup's horse loses a shoe.
Not exactly a clean getaway.
Now, Goldman explains that Morgenstern's original ending was this lady or the tiger type thing, very ambiguous.
And Goldman's dad made up his own romantic ending, which Goldman prefers, of course.
Goldman talks about reading Buttercup's Baby, and even Columbia University thought it was satire. But he wasn't emotionally attached to it, not like his own novels.
He was worried he'd lost his touch, that he couldn't write anything as good as The Princess Bride.
But then his son, Jason, really turned his life around. And there's this great moment. Willie gets upset because he thinks Fezzik dies in Buttercup's Baby. He says, no way Fezzik dies.
He's not having it.
Okay, so we get a little taste of Buttercup's Baby. They're on One Tree Island where Waverly is born. Inigo is her guard, Fezzik her babysitter.
And then Waverly's kidnapped, and Fezzik blames himself.
There's this weird fragment about Inigo and a woman he can't marry in Italy. It doesn't really make sense, but apparently it reveals Humperdinck's plot to kidnap Waverly.
It's all very convoluted.
Then there's this final scene. They're surrounded by trees, Inigo's bleeding, Wesley's not breathing, and Buttercup's only hope is Fezzik.
Talk about high stakes.
Fezzik has this moment of poetic inspiration, and then Humperdinck shoots him with an arrow. Humperdinck thinks he's won. He admires the beautiful trees of Florin. Goldman mentions that Morgenstern spent 65 pages describing those trees, but he cut it all.
Thank goodness.
Westley says the whirlpool has them now, and Buttercup's like, okay, what's the plan, Westley?
She's not messing around.
They need to get to One Tree Island to heal, but the Armada can't even get through the whirlpool.
It seems impossible.
But Westley says, we have Fezzik.
Wait, what?
Fezzik's all for it, and Wesley's plan is for him to swim them through the whirlpool.
That's crazy, but also kind of awesome.
Then we get this funny bit where Buttercup and Westley are talking about, well, intimacy. She pretends to know all about it, talks about the great controversy.
He's bluffing.
They decide to experiment, lying close together on a blanket.
I think we all know where this is going.
Buttercup confesses how much she suffered when she thought Wesley was dead, and they talk about moving to America.
A fresh start.
And Wesley tells her the exact moment he fell in love with her. We get glimpses of their life on One Tree Island with Waverly. Fezzik is incredibly protective of her. She calls him Shade.
It's so sweet.
And then there's this scene where Fezzik carries Waverly through a storm. He's injured, but he protects her. His last thought is, thank God I was a giant after all.
Oh, that's sad.
And then, well, it ends there.
Just like that.
Goldman talks about living alone in New York, feeling like his best writing days are behind him. And then he moves on to the reading group guide.
So, no happily ever after for Buttercup's Baby.
It seems not. But hey, that's the magic of stories, isn't it? They stay with us even when they end.
And sometimes they leave us wanting more.
And that's our deep dive into William Goldman's The Princess Bride.
We've gone behind the scenes, uncovered those little details that make the story even richer, even more fascinating.
From Andre the Giant to the Six-Fingered Sword, from Goldman's personal struggles to those heartwarming anecdotes about the story's impact.
It's a reminder that even the most beloved stories have their own fascinating backstories.
So what do you think? How do those behind-the-scenes details change your view of the story?
What does Goldman's experience tell us about the creative process, about the power of stories to connect with us on a deeply personal level.
We'd love to hear your thoughts, and who knows, maybe our next deep dive will take us into Buttercup's baby itself. Until then, happy reading.
And happy watching.